You know that your bowel disease isn't random. That's why you're here looking for alternative options. And I know this video is a bit long, but don't let it scare you off because I promise you the information here will equip you to change your life and finally arm yourself with the tools you need to be an advocate on finding a natural way out of this thing. And I'm going to prove it to you that it's possible. Now, this episode here, this video I'm putting out, it's actually a lecture I've done for the Priority Health Academy. It's a functional medicine academy designed for physicians who are leaving their practice, who understand I don't want my patients on drugs and medications or surgeries for the rest of their life. Something has to be causing this. I want to know what it is. And this lecture was designed for this academy, and I had the pleasure of lecturing on bowel disease there a few times a year. And so by watching this, you're finally going to understand what is causing your IBD, where it comes from. And I'm going to go through the primary causes of over 300 different cases we've now successfully reversed. And you're going to understand what causes inflammation, why it's there, that it's not random. You're going to know that your case probably is not autoimmune. It's most likely not genetic because genetics don't cause this disease. They just make you susceptible. And of course, that it can't be an unknown cause. There's way too many factors at play for there to be no reason why it's happening. We're going to talk about bowel disease around the world and why North America is less than 5% of the global population, but has more than 50% of the disease. I'm going to run you through some studies and show you can actually take these to your doctor and say, hey, I think you're wrong. I want alternatives, and here's why. We're going to talk about what is destroying your gut so you can understand where this is coming from. The only two reasons we get sick will expand on toxicities and deficiencies, and of course, the primary drivers of Crohn's colitis that I've seen in my practice, as well as reviewing a colonoscopy report of a woman who actually was diagnosed in 2013 with severe ulcerative colitis, was going to have her colon removed because of the severity of it, and in 16 weeks, she came back with a perfect or near perfect colonoscopy. We're going to review that report with you and show you what she did as well. So please don't let the length of time for this one to scare you off. It's life-changing information. Pick away it if you have to. And if you say the video is too long to watch, there is an audio version in the notes below that I've attached to the podcast. You can grab that one instead. But it's so important you get through this episode because it has everything you need to completely change the direction of your future for bowel disease. Enjoy.
Okay, welcome everyone to October 2024, our master class. And we have today a guest speaker, Josh, who many people already know from our previous lectures and also the Q&A. He's kind of a fixture with us, kind of on faculty at the PHA. So I'm going to let Josh Deck kind of introduce himself to some of the folks in the audience or those listening later who don't know him and his expertise, and then we'll get started on our event tonight.
Thank
Josh?
you so much, JP. Appreciate that. Great to be here. If you don't know me, my name's Josh Deck. I'm a holistic nutritionist, ex-paramedic, and I specialize now in the Crohn's colitis space. My job effectively is to help people figure out why they have IBD because none of it is random ever. And that's what I want to go through with you guys today. I thought I'd take a very chic approach instead of Breaking Bad. We are breaking bowel disease today. And the whole idea behind this is that everything we've been told, and I want to encourage you to really entertain this thought that everything you've been told about your Crohn's colitis patients to date is wrong, backwards, misinformed, or lacking a huge piece of information. And that's really what this lecture aims to do today. And so the first thing I want to go over is just quickly what we're going to be talking about as a general overview for today. So number one, I do want to redefine the way we see IBD. So our Crohn's and colitis patients, when we start to look at it, what does it actually mean rather than just making assumptions based on what we've been told? The second one I want to go over is causes and factors, which will be, of course, the things that I see in my practice. We've now helped reverse over 300 different cases of Crohn's and colitis, most of which are fully off the medication now. Many have yet to go. And there's still a fair bit of layers. It's not a simple process, but we will get there. And of course, I'm going to take you even through some case studies. I got a few that we'll bring up, but I do have one in particular. I was able to get colonoscopy reports from a 16-week trial. And we're talking with a patient diagnosed back in 2013 with severe who was about to have her colon removed. And so we're going to have a chance to go over that. And then, of course, open to Q&A. Now, moving on here, let's look at IBD as it is defined. Medically speaking, It's long-term chronic inflammatory conditions of the tissues in the digestive tract. Now, it's Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Now, we don't typically know why they happen, genetic, idiopathic, autoimmune, environmental. There's a lot of assumptions being made, but IBD, by its definition, is just inflammation of the GI tract in the two umbrellas of Crohn's and colitis. And so, just to break these down, just to give you guys a bit of a refresher, or if you're listening on another platform, Crohn's disease is going to be something that's inflamed mouth to anus, primarily the small intestine. We do see it to be a little bit different than colitis, which is, of course, of the colon primarily. Now, in Crohn's disease, you can get lesions in your mouth, perianal lesions or fissures of some kind, a lot of the small intestines. And instead of going in long strips, it is patches known as payers, patches, and they tend to go pretty deep and they tend to go beyond just the first layer. So rather than likening it to scuffing your knee on the sidewalk walking outside, instead it does really cut deep, and some complications, fistulas, strictures, and of course malnutrition. So the fistulas, as infections, tend to burrow into the tissues. Strictures when we get narrowing, and malnutrition is an absorption issue. And in colitis, instead of patches of the small intestine, it tends to be large chunks and strips in the large intestine. And it tends to be very surface, like that scuffing of the knee. And of course, there are all the common signs and symptoms across Crohn's and colitis, like blood, mucus, pain, changes of appetite, etc. And we are prone, of course, to things like toxic megacolon, which can be highly emergent, and colon cancer and ulcerative colitis. Now, I want to go to the assumption here that we talked about, that it's this autoimmune condition. We know, or we're told, IBD is autoimmune, genetic, idiopathic, or unknown, and possibly environmental. This is per the Crohn's Colitis Foundation, the Mayo Clinic, and all the big entities who say this is what it is. So autoimmunity is simply a condition where one's immune system attacks one's own tissues. So your body is attacking itself. That's the definition of autoimmunity. And we're going to break this apart here coming up. Now, current treatments, of course, for IBD, you can start off with something very simple, corticosteroids. We see a lot of prednisone, budesonide, or mesalamines like your 5-ASAs. And of course, there are immunosuppressants, biologics. And if these don't work, snip, snip, out comes the organs. And this is a major issue that I have with this kind of as a general whole. And something I want to look at here, I'll get to that one in just a minute. Let's move on to the next slide here. So let's talk about inflammation. Inflammation is kind of a funny thing because, again, if we assume that this condition is autoimmune, if we assume they're genetic, we assume they're idiopathic, then we assume across the board that inflammation has a reason. It's a natural response to injury or infection. In the case of Crohn's colitis, to define it as idiopathic actually breaks the foundational layer of what inflammation is. And so we want to keep in mind, and this is a thread we'll pull throughout this lecture, that the body does not make mistakes. We only get sick for two reasons, ever, across the board. And I cannot find any evidence showing otherwise. It is deficiencies or toxicities. And those deficiencies may be things like nutrients, it may be micros or macros, even water can be a deficiency, but something has to create it. Or a toxicity where the body is reacting. We'll talk about some of those toxicities look like, but as an overview, it can be microbes, it can be metals, it can be pesticides and toxins, and you name it, flu, virus, COVID, it can be anything. So I want to picture this. If you're out going for a walk, you got a patient who comes to you and they're going for a walk, they stepped on a nail, they come to you and say, "Doc, it's infected, it's inflamed, I got this nail in my foot, I need some help, I don't know what to do." Now, as a doctor, how crazy would it be if you looked at that patient and went, "Oh boy, that nail's pretty bad, but it's just part of your DNA now. It's kind of part of your biology. There's nothing we can do. And here's some numbing cream. Use this to manage the symptoms for the rest of your life. And if it gets really bad, we'll cut your foot off." You'd lose your license immediately. When we look at things like chronic inflammatory conditions like Crohn's or colitis, what do? Well, it's just part of your DNA and your biology. There's nothing we can do about it. It's inflamed for no reason. Here's some medications to manage the symptoms for the rest of your life, and it does not work. Snip, snip, we'll cut the colon out. It's the same ideology across a different lens, and this is where medicine, I believe, gets absolutely crazy and kind of wrong. And so let's talk about these a little bit here. The current approach Genetic, idiopathic, autoimmune, therefore we can't do anything, therefore take the drugs or do surgery. What we have to look at instead, number one, how could it possibly be genetic if 50 to 60% of the global cases reside in North America alone, which is less than 5% of the global population? When 5% has 50%, we don't call it genetic, we call it an epidemic. And this is why we have to start changing a lens on that. Number two, if it's idiopathic, there's no known cause, it kind of just happening. But we can see that cases have risen over 3,000% since the 1950s, when estimates were about 15 and 100,000. To the 1970s was about 45. To the 1990s, it was 150 to 250 per 100,000. To today, where it's 463 people per 100,000 in North America have Crohn's or colitis. This is massive. And we're talking, that's what, 5%? That's an insane amount. On top of this, 70 to 72%, depending on the studies we look at, complain of some kind of regular gut issue, like constipation, diarrhea, cramping, bloating, pain. And we know that 17% of all IBD diagnoses have a previous diagnosis of IBS. Well, if 70% of the whole population complains of symptoms in line with IBS, it makes sense only 17 to 20% have a diagnosis, and then it can progress. So we do have a progressive spectrum to consider. The next one is if it's autoimmune. How can it be autoimmune? A, if we're not actually testing every patient for antibodies, we're making an assumption. And B, I'm going to show you some information coming up here to show you that most cases do not have antibodies. And the ones that do, they are likely not actually attacking their own tissues. I'm working on a new hypothesis for this. I can't find any research, but I would love to hear from you. Anything in your patients, your clinic, or your contacts, we can research some of this because this lines up with the 300 plus cases we've seen so far. And I'm excited to get into that with you here in a moment. So let's talk about this genetics. Genes we know, we've mapped the entire human genome. We know that there is no single gene that causes these diseases. We know there are genes that are correlated to the disease, where you can say, okay, well, if you have this gene, you are more likely to get Crohn's or colitis, but there's no single gene that causes high blood pressure, that causes liver failure, that causes Crohn's or colitis. It doesn't exist. And we're going to go over some of that correlative information here. But remember, correlation does not equal causation. We know this as scientists, as clinicians. So we have to dig deeper. And so I'm going to show you again, it's actually a shockingly low percentage of people who do not have any genetic components associated. And then, of course, we know genes are not operating in and of their own devices. They are strongly influenced by their environment. Certain microbes, toxins, nutrients, stress, infections, all of these things can influence how your genes express for better or for worse. So we also have to stop blaming our genes. So let's look at this next chart here we got put together. Now, you won't be able to find these charts. I punched a bunch of data into AI and told it to create charts for me. So I don't know how to use actual charting software, but these are beautiful. So these are mine. So here's what we're looking at. You can see in green, these are the bars representing ulcerative colitis genetics or the associated links. And in blue is Crohn's disease. And these are your percentage ratios. On the highest end, 25% of ulcerative colitis patients have this HLA gene that's identified. At the highest end of Crohn's, you have your NOD2 and CARD15 genes. So the most we see in the genetics is 20 to 25%, which means 75 to 80% of these patients do not have any genetic correlation whatsoever. How can we continue to call it a genetic disease if the correlation's not even there, not in a strong enough way to make it identifiable or even something we can really dive into to fix? It's not like we can edit it through CRISPR. There's nothing that's going to be done. And on the low end, we got 5% that we're calling this TNF-SF15 gene, for example. 5% correlation. Why do we even bother looking at it? And I know that's kind of a stupid question in a room full of doctors and clinicians, but you get the idea. We're blaming the wrong things. And so the next one here, I do want to look at some of these genes and explore a little bit more in detail, though, so we can understand why. This is a thread we're going to pull on during this talk. So let's look at some of these genes here. You can see these are the associated genes and what they're designed to do. So your PARC7s, your STAT3s, IRGMs, IL-23Rs, NOD2s, these are the genes we have associated or attributed to Crohn's and colitis and said, if you have these, it's a genetic thing, there's nothing we can really do. This is sort of the assumption. However, we have to recognize these genes have functional responsibilities. So they do certain things. And if they're affected by their environment, microbial or otherwise, the genes are going to express negatively. So let's look at how many genes we have in the blue bar. There's 4 of them in the blue bar. These are responsible for microbial interaction and microbial recognition, which means they recognize bacteria and things in the gut and they initiate an immune response. So their job is to look at this and go, wait a minute, that's a problem. Let's deal with that. We'll create an immune response. Well, if your gene is being expressed negatively, the immune response is going to be unhealthy. Therefore, when it identifies a bacteria, it's going to go haywire. And now you have a hyperinflammatory response inflaming your entire GI tract. The maths. Let's look at your IL-23Rs or STAT3s. So these ones here, right, you got IL-23R and STAT3 in green, immunomodulation. And so they play a role in regulating the immune responses to ensure that immune system does not overreact. Well, if they are being negatively impacted in their ability to read, interpret, and react, then of course they're going to overreact. Because when your body has a problem, it doesn't downregulate systems, it upregulates systems. It's on high alert. Just as if we were outside, you get stuck in traffic, somebody breaks your back window, you're driving, somebody's chasing you through traffic, you're high alert. You get in the house, what do? You shut the door, you lock it, you close the blinds, you call the police. You're on alert. Amazon guy knocks at the door, you scream. Normally you wouldn't. Neither would your genes. But considering the threat they're under, they're expressing poorly. Looking at the HLA gene, for example. Now, this one here is, again, commonly implicated in things like ulcerative colitis, especially. But this HLA gene, it's responsible for presenting microbial antigens to the immune system. It brings it forward and says, here's the problem. Do you think we should act on it? Again, if it's negatively influenced, of course, we're going to have an elevated immune response. And so the next slide here we put together is a chart. This one is the things that influence the genes, the things we just sort of talked about. So look how much of these genes are influenced by other factors. Now, the reason I put these here, microbial interaction, immune responses, inflammatory responses, environmental factors, cellular stress, diet, and nutrient transport. In the cases of inflammation, all of these things are going to be a problem. And in my clinic, in my practice, I should say, the primary things we see driving IBD, of course, are toxins, microbes we'll get to a bit more in detail, but parasites, like we see a lot of parasites. We see Clostridia, E. coli, Candida. We see certain toxins, heavy metals, poor drainage pathways, which create cellular stress, inflammatory responses, microbial interactions, and of course, our genes are reacting poorly. So the primary drivers I've seen in over 300 cases influence our genes negatively. Of course, the roles that they're responsible for are going to be poor. Of course, the outcomes of our inflammatory responses or immune pathways are going to be poor because the input does not create a healthy output. It really is, in my opinion, that simple. And so I want to show you this chart here to back up my claim. We talked about the distribution. This is for the CDC. Now, there are estimates saying that we have cases anywhere from 6 to 8 million today. It really depends on who you ask. But the CDC, in their own report back in 2019, showed that 3.1 of 4.9 million cases of Crohn's and colitis around the world were in the USA alone. 63% of the cases in less than 5%, it's about 4.7% of the global population. This is an epidemic. And I asked AI once again to put it in a visual chart representation, and you can see the cluster of IBD that we have around here with the numbers and the stats that we were able to pull. And it's interesting, this is pretty accurate to my own experience. I have a fair bit of outreach from India, a little bit from the Middle East. I do have a lot from the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, but primarily the USA. I bet you 80-90% of our clientele is USA. The rest would be some in Canada, but UK is a huge resource. And so this is a big problem. So we have to look at the westernization and industrialization of these worlds and how it's relating to the creation of these pockets of bowel disease. So ultimately, consider, are genes really to blame? If you're telling your client or your patient that it's just a genetic issue, without maybe knowing it's a lie, we are lying to our patients because we're blaming something that is more of a bystander effect. The genes are being manipulated by external factors. So it's not just genetic. Things change. Microbes, toxins, inflammation, cellular stress, detoxification, drainage pathways, diet we put in, nutrients, environment, whatever it might be, they change your genetic expression. So the first pillar of genetic, idiopathic, and autoimmune completely dismantled. Can everybody agree with me on that one? Awesome. Okay, beautiful. Love that. So let's talk about the next one then. Autoimmunity, the third leg to the table of IBD. We want to talk about this. The definition of autoimmune is your cells attacking your tissues, but you have to have antibodies for it to be autoimmune. That is the definition of autoimmunity. There is an antigen and then an antibody created, and it attacks. Bing, bang, boom, problem solved. However, if you see a lot of Crohn's colitis patients, when was the last time you tested their antibodies? When was the last time you had somebody come to you for help as a functional practitioner who has an antibody test to say, look at all the antibodies I have? That's our consideration number one. Number two, we have to ask ourselves, autoimmunity by definition is your body's attacking its own tissues. But what if it's not? A lot of the antibodies, I'm going to show you some charts here in a minute what these antibodies look like, but these antibodies not only attack potentially your own tissues, but they're more likely attacking certain proteins or membranes or certain cells within the body. And again, by bystander effect, your tissues are simply caught in the crossfire. So your Crohn's and colitis is inflammation by proximity, not your body attacking itself. And so we're going to talk about that here in a minute. So let's get into this one here a little bit. So these are the antibody charts that we have for Crohn's and colitis, and this is pulled directly from, you can find these on PubMed and all over the place. So the most we see here in red, this is ulcerative colitis. Blue, of course, is your Crohn's disease per the legend. Now, we see a much higher prevalence of antibodies in Crohn's disease. No doubt about that. But looking at this chart, about 70% of all patients who've been tested for antibodies with ulcerative colitis have this P-ANCA antibody. So this is our perinuclear anti-neutrophil antibody. So this means your body is attacking the neutrophils. What's the number one thing that we test in patients when we're looking for the progression or regression of bowel disease? It's going to be calprotectin. Well, calprotectin is simply a byproduct of neutrophil activity. So if you have an abundance of neutrophils coming in to clean up something, neutrophils operate through phagocytosis. So if they're in there cleaning things up, of course, you're going to have elevated calprotectin. It's like having a lot of cars in one parking lot idling. You're going to have a lot more exhaust in the area. Duh. And so why are we looking at calprotectin rather than going deeper? Look at these other ones. ASCA, anti-OMPC, all these antibodies, we're talking 10% or less in ulcerative colitis. Okay, so we have elevated neutrophils in ulcerative colitis. That's a gimme. They're there for a reason, right? And then in Crohn's disease, we do see a lot more antibody activity. Well, let's take a look at these antibodies. We're assuming, again, the definition of autoimmune is that your body has antibodies attacking your own tissues. However, this chart shows you what other things these same antibodies can attack. Many of these are the primary causes of Crohn's and colitis we just talked about. Parasites, mold, fungus, yeast, overgrowth, toxicity. So take a look at this one. P-ANCA, right? The antibody we see 70% of the time in ulcerative colitis. Antibiotics can elevate it. IBD drug therapy. So I believe I'll double check this one. I have a chart specifically somewhere, but mesalamine, azathioprine, Imuran, we see these creating the exact same antibodies. So if your patient comes in and does have antibodies, number one, are they medicated? If they are, that can create the same antibody. Look at Crohn's disease, fungi, bacteria, IBD drug therapy, bacteria in mold, bacteria, fungi, parasites, anti-12, bacteria, antibiotics, IBD drug therapy. All these things that we see as the primary thing your body's trying to react to can create the antibodies. The drugs we use can create the antibodies. So to say it's autoimmune, as if your body randomly began starting attacking your own tissues out of the blue because it was bored, woke up one day and your body was just revolting, it doesn't make any sense. That is a logical fallacy. They have to be going after something. And antibodies are going to be more likely in many cases attacking a foreign pathogen that maybe looks like your own tissues or proteins that you create. And so if we have some correlation here, let's look at this. This is sort of my hypothesis I'm now working on, and I would love some help with this one if you guys want to, maybe get a Nobel Prize with me here. But take a look at this. Your body, it's likely inflamed due to the bystander effect. If your body is attacking something within its own tissues, that would be a problem. But given the fact that we've got 300 plus cases we've now reversed, we've seen all these commonalities, bacteria, could be E. coli, we've seen Giardia, different parasites, we've seen E. histo and Blastocystis hominis and D. fragilis. There's 1,400 kinds of parasites that can attack humans out of the million or so that we believe exist on planet Earth. And so, if they're attacking other things or your body's reacting to them, it's a problem. Fungal overgrowth, major driver, right? These are the things. But the antibodies will attack protein specific or the membrane specific to those drivers. Therefore, we must ask, are they attacking your tissues? Look at Pianka. 70% of all ulcerative colitis patients tested in the study had this antibody. So this is the anti-neutrophil antibody. Is it attacking the neutrophils, or because the neutrophils operate through phagocytosis, they eat and consume? Is this antibody going after the neutrophils themselves or going after the protein contained within the neutrophil? This would change the entire ideology of autoimmunity entirely, would change the landscape. If we have this anti-neutrophil antibody, the assumption is that your body's attacking your own neutrophils. But if the neutrophils are there to clean something up, what are they cleaning up? And if the antibodies are there, are they attacking the neutrophils or the protein inside the neutrophils that they're trying to clean up? If this is in fact the case, and I'm telling you guys, I need help trying to prove this theory, but it would entirely change the landscape of how we see autoimmunity, especially in the case of IBD, possibly the landscape of autoimmunity across the world. Now, I did run a search for research like this. It sounds like there's some theories ongoing, but nothing conclusive at this time. So this would be forefront type of stuff. If you can find any information on it, please do contact me and I'll provide as many bodies as we need to get the testing done. But that's my thought currently. So are we making sense so far on the antibodies and how that's another bullshit logical fallacy? Perfect. All right, let's move this one on then. Next one, idiopathic, unknown cause. Well, we talked about cases rising exponentially, 3,000% in the last 75 years. So something has to be causing it. If idiopathic is by definition, there's no known cause, is that there isn't a known cause or we're not recognizing the causes willingly. We're going to talk about some of this as well and what's gone on in the world. But look at the chart we just showed you, the world map. Look at the concentration. European countries, especially Western Europe, so very industrialized, USA, and even some Australia, New Zealand. These are the most westernized cultures in the world. They have some of the highest food share in the world, the highest pesticide use in the world. Look at India. They have something like 8,000 pesticides approved for use across billions of people, relatively small concentration, even just the numbers of IBD. The USA has 18 to 20,000 pesticides approved for use. Glyphosate, known to cause cancer, labeled as a carcinogen. In fact, Bayer, who was bought by Monsanto, actually just paid out recently, I believe it was 11 or 14 billion dollars to settle over 100,000 lawsuits, with 30,000 to 40,000 still pending for glyphosate causing cancer, yet it is still approved for use in the USA and banned in dozens of other countries. So if it's idiopathic, something is driving it. We do have more medication use than ever before. It's actually gone up, calculated for inflation, by 222 times since the 1950s. We have more processed and refined foods than ever before, more sugars than ever before, 101 pounds per year for the average adult in the USA. That is the size of a panda bear, just to give you guys some context, okay? Sugars, seed oils are up exponentially. There's another interesting theory we look at called generational dysbiosis. If you're familiar with the work from, I believe it's Stanford, Dr. Justin Sonnenberg and his wife Erica Sonnenberg, and they talk about this generational dysbiosis that we are going to get to here and sort of talk about in a minute. But these are what I believe are the driving causes. Now, this little chart again we put together to show you the increase in bowel disease over the last 75 years. If we don't know what's causing this is a 45-degree line. If we don't know what's causing this exponential growth, we better figure it out pretty freaking fast. That's my first thought. And so ultimately, I want to pose the thought, is this truly an unknown cause, or are we ignoring the cause? Now, dare I say the conspiracy word, but consider, The three biggest industries in the USA make up 18% of the entire GDP, worth $4.7 trillion a year. That's going to be hospital stays in like medical care, health insurance, and pharmaceuticals. Now, you'll notice how many CEOs will bounce around from big food to big ag to big pharma to FDA. They just jump around. Now, will we say it's one big conspiracy to make us all sick? Who knows? But can we certainly say there are special interest groups approving certain toxins and certain pathogens for whatever elusive profit? Probably. Are they doing it intentionally or because they're asked to or because they're lobbied to? Who knows? But the reality is there's something terrible going on that's really causing these problems and it's being ignored by higher up authorities. And this is a big driver of our issues. So let's go through this really quick. Primary causes of IBD. We've seen it increase from 1950 to today by 3,000%. So let's talk about generational dysbiosis. Generational dysbiosis is this inheritance of lesser and lesser microbes over generations. Justin Sonnenberg actually did some work. I'll show you this one here. And he actually did some work through mice and over their grandchildren and great grandchildren by slowly changing their diets, introducing them to pesticides, etc. They found that, say, the great great grandmother, we'll talk about that one. I'll just jump ahead in my slides here a minute. So let's simplify this down to the easiest part. If great grandma has 1,000 microbes, we start introducing some toxins. Then guess what? The next baby down has 800 microbes. This is grandma. The microbes we get in our body are inherited through breastfeeding, through our environment, through birth canal, all these different natural processes we inherit our microbiomes. So then great grandma has 1,000, more chemicals are introduced, grandma gets 800, and then she gives birth to mom who has 600, and then you get 400. You have just inherited dysbiosis. So without even starting, you've already got lower defenses due to industrialization, toxicities, etc. Now remember, we talked about the only two ways you can get sick ever is toxicities and deficiencies. And so you have a lower defenses because your microbiome, I mean, 70+% up to 90 of your immune system is made and matured inside of your gut. We know that the galt and the malt, that's your mucus layer and your lymphatic associated lymphoid tissues rather. So your galt and your malt, your gut associated lymphoid tissues, what I meant to say, they're inside the gut. So your immune system largely comes from here, but if your defenses are down, your genes are overactive, your immune and inflammatory responses are overactive, of course, you're going to have an elevated response because you don't have the microbes to keep these things in check because you have inherited dysbiosis. This is a major concern. And so we start to compound this all together. What does it actually look like? Now, in my practice, I put together a little Venn diagram for you here to show you the primary causes of IBD that I see. Now, this first one here, of course, we talk about toxins, microbial imbalances, which could be argued a toxicity and our deficiencies. But what leads to autoimmunity is a trigger of some kind. We'll get into stress. We'll talk about the genetics and, of course, leaky gut. These are the causes on the outside rings. This is what drives bowel disease. And on the inside, when we compound these, it can create these autoimmune cycles. But then we have to go back. Is it autoimmune with antibodies? Is it actually genetic? And what lines up? What is the body attacking or going after, and why is it being influenced? Now, I'm going to skim through this next part with you quickly because this is taking a bit longer to go through than I thought, but I want to briefly go over microbiome development with you. So there are four main places we get them. First is going to be in utero, when we're born or when we're being developed. Now, it's previously been understood that the baby's or a fetal gut microbiome is sterile, but there is, of course, this fetal microchimerism where we know 33% of the metabolites in blood are actually byproducts of bacterium. And so what shares with the baby and mom is blood. This is our fetal microchimerism. There's sharing of DNA, sharing of cells, sharing of tissues, and even microbes. Look what happens in pregnancy. Typically, we see a lot of inflammatory markers elevated in pregnancy. We see blood sugar issues in pregnancy because we start to see a decreased insulin sensitivity. And so it's almost like type 2 diabetes. Well, if you're already sick, of course, when you compound type 2 diabetes in pregnancy, it elevates and gets worse. But what this is actually doing is you shunt food away from mom and nutrients so more can get to baby. We have inflammatory processes or leaky gut in mom because that actually can allow this translocation of microbes and other benefits from mom to baby. We treat pregnancy like a disease because we see inflammation, because we see insulin sensitivity issues. But in a healthy body, they wouldn't be a problem. They're a problem in an already unhealthy body that gets pushed over the edge by these natural occurrences. And so there are a few things in utero that can happen. We know mom's gut microbiome does change. And this is actually producing more beneficial bacteria that the baby first gets through breastfeeding and through the birth canal. So a lot of your bifidose and lactose. So this is a natural process. And then, of course, in birth, we know vaginal birth is best. We know that babies who come out C-section actually have worse outcomes. We talk about failure to thrive. They're more prone to eczemas and psoriasis and diabetes and other conditions. And of course, as we're growing, it's like seeding a meadow, that microbiome develops. Best case scenario, you are born naturally, you eat organic food, you grow up on a farm, pesticide free, you play with the animals, you're outside, you're eating food off the land. That is the best way to seed your microbiome. Let's look back at that color chart that we saw. Looking at Western industrialized countries, we do the opposite of these things. We do C-sections about 30% of the time. Bottle feeding is being pushed often more than breastfeeding. We live in cities, we live indoors, we hyper sanitize everything. And what happened during COVID? We hyper sanitized, shut in, didn't see anybody. We did the opposite of what we need to get our microbes to over or to begin reproducing. And on another note, we also have a lot of junk foods that we start to incur. We talked about 100 pounds per year, the average adult consuming sugar, alcohol. Antibiotic consumption is up 43% from the year 2000. Fast food, on average, we're talking 3 times a week. These are nuclear bombs that we drop on our gut. Medication spent is up to almost 1.2. This is back in 2018. I think we're closer to like 2 trillion now per year. Something else to consider. Here's an interesting chart for you. Pull this from drkate.com. This is the introduction of seed oils, your canola, corn, sunflower, soy, cottonseed, vegetable oils. Now we blame red meat, we blame fats and all these things for our gut health and illness that we have today. Well, in the 1950s, that consumption actually went down. Seed oils went up. Well, let's take a look at this next one. Here's that chart that we talked about, the increase of IBD. We can see the rise from the 1950s. Let's put them side by side, and what do you know? Now, I realize correlation does not equal causation, but we know that nutrition has a huge role to play in the health of our guts. If our guts are unhealthy, so are our bowels. And so here's what I see in my practice as our primary drivers. Stress is a big one. Environmental is a big one. Microbes, candida, clostridia, E. coli, parasites. I've seen children at 9 years old with loads of antibiotic use where they came in with bowel disease when they have no family history because you've destroyed your microbiome. When your microbiome isn't there or healthy, what comes in? Other invaders, other microbes will fill in the space, which leads to or can be contributed to by these deficiencies. So macro and micronutrients, short chain fatty acids. One could argue dietary fiber, but that's actually another conversation for another time. So I do want to take you through a quick case study here. This is Larissa. Larissa's a 43-year-old female, came to see us earlier this year. She was diagnosed with IBD, moderate to severe, Mayo score of 3 or 4, I believe. We'll take a look. Back in 2013, she tried every medication. They even moved her on to Ulcerative, and things got worse. They said, we can remove your colon. And she actually described it as having squirrels with the razor blades running around her insides. And the bleeding was so severe. In fact, her first call with me, she was on the toilet while we were doing the call. It was so uncontrollable and severe. And so I'm going to show you some of her colonoscopy reports here. So this is the first one that we do have. Number 1, non-thrombosed external hemorrhoids, moderate to severe ulcerative colitis and proctosigmoidosis or sigmoiditis. She had IVs that she had started. They gave her all the drugs, gave her Lialda, put her on Ulcerative. Okay. So she's moderate to severe, and you can see the lesions inside her colonoscopy report. We can also see over here inflammation found in the colon, Mayo score of 3, spontaneous severe bleeding, and ulcerations. Previous examinations, the first one we just looked at was September 2023. This is February. Even with the drug, she's continuing to get worse. Colonic mucosa, active colitis, erosion, cryptitis, crypt distortion, all the things. just the myriads going on. This they wanted to remove it. So this is before starting our protocol. What we did with her, 16 weeks, we had to focus on drainage. Detoxing is collecting the trash. Drainage is moving it out to the curb. We found parasites. Take a look at these ones. Negative for dysplasia, no increase in eosinophils, normal colonic mucosa, large bowel ascending, transverse, descending, proximal, normal, normal, normal. She had one spot of a little bit of colitis left and a little bit of remaining hemorrhoid after 16 weeks. Mind you, she's got diagnosed in 2013 and had years prior. Normal stomach, normal examined duodenum. The examined portion of the ileum was normal. Single patch of moderately active Mayo 2 ulcerative colitis. Improved since the last examination and they did biopsy. Let's take a look at our next one. The examined portion of the ileum was normal. Single patch, moderately active, Mayo score 2. And look at her colon. Pink, healthy, and near perfect. One little spot that they had found. And I'll just put a side by side for you guys here. So this is our before and after. The one was drugs, immunosuppressives. It was dealing with the ideology of it being genetic, autoimmune, unmanageable, idiopathic. Let's suppress the immune system rather than asking what is the immune system reacting to, and is it autoimmune at all? Are your tissues attack, or is your body attacking your own tissues, or is it attacking an invader? And this is what happens after just 16 weeks. And so coming towards the end of this thing here, I will show you guys a few slides just so you're bracing yourselves of what we actually pulled out of our clients this year in the IBD space. I'd say about 80% of our clients do actively have some kind of parasite activity. Upwards of 100% will have them in there, but probably 80+% have these as drivers. So this one here came out of one of our clients as a nurse, 15 years of IBD, same thing, full of melanomas, tried the Entyvio, tried everything, and 16 weeks, went after mold, went after parasites, they were gone. She had multiple ropeworms. This one here could have been a tapeworm, could be a roundworm, came out of a 15-year-old boy. Second day on a parasite protocol supporting drainage, and these were also from the same nurse. Now these next ones get a little wild. These are what's living inside people's bodies. They hide in the crypts, in folds. They hide in the bile ducts. They hide in the liver, the pancreas. They can hide in the appendix. They're very hard to remove. Parasites can feed off of muscle, lung, liver, lymphatic fluid. You wonder why your patients are chronically anemic, going in for iron infusions constantly. They love hemoglobin and iron. When their levels are low, we have to ask why. And these are things we see coming out of our clients. It's a little bit unnerving, truthfully, but this is what can be. Now, some of this, one could argue this might be mucoid plaque. However, these are very clearly some kind of worm. And so here's what I want to leave you guys with. It is so important in practice to challenge the notion and just accept the standard of care to say it's genetic, autoimmune, idiopathic. That leaves us with the only possible treatment of drugs to suppress the immune system. If you accept the fact that your body makes mistakes, that disease is innate to your biology, like the nail in the foot is just part of your DNA, and all you can do is give numbing cream and cut the foot off, we apply the same thing to bowel disease or any other chronic disease. We cannot accept that diseases are genetic, autoimmune, idiopathic, or part of our DNA. Remember that inflammation is never random. Your body is always reacting to something. It is an innate response to defend you, not attack you. You actually have probably 200 checks and balances of your immune system to decide to attack you, or if something attacks you, to go after it, to balance your inflammation pathways, to check your immune system. There are countless checks and balances. It doesn't make mistakes. And the problem is that the standard of care, you're told to follow a protocol, don't ask questions. There's no critical thinking. There's no innovation, no personal or individualization, which means you're stuck just doing what you're told. And so standard of care, I believe, is a cancer. The next one is medication and surgery, obviously, is not the only answer because they're addressing the tissues that are inflamed, not the thing inflaming them. And everything has a why. Even a GI map. You get a GI map from a patient and it's really messy. You're taking their gut bacteria. It's all over the place. Are we asking why? Is it antibiotic use? Is it environmental? Is it a microbe that entered the system? Is it pesticide exposure, heavy metals, some inflammatory response that created the groundwork for these bacterium to overgrow? Every piece of information has a deeper root of why. So even a GI map doesn't give us enough. Why did it get screwed up? There's always something to look at. And one last closing thing here, I do want to give you guys some information for your patients just to share. Of course, you can always reach me, gutsolution.ca, all singular, gutsolution.ca for Canada. We do have a podcast. I do lectures like this every single week. I started publishing them recently over the last few months. It's free, available everywhere, called Reversing Crohn's and Colitis Naturally. And we actually take the video versions and they are available on YouTube at the Gut Health Solution. That's all the information I got for you guys. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I really do hope this makes an impact for you and your patients in your practice.